does it feel like to run a country when almost every person who held your job before you is already dead? Because in one single year, Iran lost its top leadership 3 separate times. Not once, 3 times. And every single replacement walked into a job that had already killed the man before him. Before we go any further, I need 30 seconds of your time. If this story pulls you in the way it pulled me in while I researched it, smash that like button right now before you forget. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories that most people never get to hear properly. And if you want to see exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes, hit subscribe, because this is only the first layer. Let's start with the number everyone already knows. 40. That is how many senior Iranian commanders Israel says it wiped out in under 60 seconds. Not over a week, not over a month, 60 seconds. On the morning of February the 28th, 2026, Israeli jets hit a secure compound in central Tehran where Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was sitting with his closest circle of commanders. Around 30 bombs fell on that one location within that single minute. When the dust settled, roughly 40 of the most powerful men inside Iran's government were gone, and so was Khamenei himself. Sit with that for a second. 40 of the most protected human beings on Earth, guarded by one of the most paranoid security systems on the planet, erased before most of the country even knew a war had started. This wasn't some lucky missile that happened to land in the right place. Someone had to know, days or even weeks in advance, that this exact group of men would be standing in this exact room at this exact hour. That kind of certainty does not come from guessing. It comes from watching. Quietly, patiently, for a very long time. The Israeli military later confirmed the details themselves. Among the dead were the armed forces chief of staff, the head of the Revolutionary Guard, the defense minister, and one of Khamenei's most trusted senior advisors. All gone in the same wave. Iran's own state media eventually confirmed. Khamenei's death days later, once the shock inside the country had settled enough for officials to even speak publicly about it. Now here is where most retellings of this story stop. They treat it like a single dramatic headline, a clean and shocking ending. One night, one strike, one number. But that is exactly where the real story actually begins. Because Iran's leadership was not destroyed once that year. It was destroyed, rebuilt from nothing, and then destroyed again. And the man who was supposed to hold the whole country together after that first collapse was hunted down and killed less than 3 weeks after stepping into the role. So hold on to that thought as we go deeper. If a government keeps rebuilding its top leadership, and the new leaders keep getting killed too, at what point does it stop being one shocking event and start being something else entirely? A method, a standing policy, a hunting pattern that simply refuses to stop on its own. And let's slow down and go back to that opening morning, because the small details matter far more than the big number ever could. For decades, Iran built its government around one core belief, that it could never be destroyed from the inside. Since the revolution in 1979, the state survived wars, sanctions, uprisings, and open hostility from some of the strongest militaries in the world. That survival was never an accident. It was engineered. Layer after layer of loyal institutions, each one quietly watching the others, each one designed to make sure no single group could ever seize total control in turn. Against the regime alone. For nearly half a century, that design worked exactly as intended, which is what makes that opening minute so difficult to fully process. A system built to survive almost anything did not just get damaged that morning. Its entire top layer was removed before most ordinary Iranians even understood their country was at war. And it was not only the very top that fell. Reports from that same wave named an entire second tier of officials killed alongside the 7 men in that room, the head of intelligence for Iran's wartime command structure, the officer who managed Khamenei's own military communications, both the current and a former head of the country's most sensitive nuclear research body, the commander in charge of Iran's missile and drone forces, senior figures from the Police Intelligence Service and the Intelligence Ministry, along with several officers whose names never even made it into public reporting. Look closely at that list, because it is not random at all. It reads like a checklist. The political leader, his personal communications, chief, the conventional, military command, the missile and drone program, the nuclear research apparatus, domestic intelligence, police intelligence. In under 60 seconds, 5 or 6 completely separate arms of the Iranian state, each one normally kept apart from the others on purpose, were struck together in the same place at the same time. That separation is not a small detail. It is the entire point of how a government like Iran's is built. States like this deliberately create overlapping, competing branches of power so that no single institution ever controls everything. If no, one branch holds it all. No one branch can turn on the regime and bring the whole country down alone. It is a defense against betrayal from within, a wall built to stop danger from growing inside the house. But that wall was never designed to stop a threat arriving from outside the house. On that morning, every one of those rival branches happened to be sitting in the very same room, and a single, carefully planned strike did not need to break through 5 separate walls. It only needed to know exactly where that one room was. There's a strange, almost bitter irony sitting underneath all of this. Iran spent decades constructing a leadership system specifically engineered to survive betrayal from within its own ranks. Rival agencies watching each other so closely that no single general or minister could ever quietly seize power alone. That design worked flawlessly for nearly 50 years at doing exactly what it was built to do. And then, in a single minute, it failed catastrophically the moment the danger came from somewhere the design never accounted for. Not from inside the room, from far above it, watching patiently for months, maybe even years, before ever pulling the trigger. The timing itself tells its own story. Israeli officials later said the operation was launched to catch a narrow window, while surprise was still possible. Early reporting described more than 200 aircraft striking close to 500 targets in that opening phase, with radar systems and air defenses hit first to clear a path, followed almost immediately by strikes on missile infrastructure and leadership. This was never one bomb on one building. It was a fully layered, precisely timed operation. Air defenses. First, command and control right behind it. All compressed into one short window, timed so tightly that Iran's ability to even see the attack coming, let alone respond to it, was gone before most of the country understood anything had begun. If you are the kind of person who actually notices details other people skip past, stay with me, because the story gets far stranger from here, and it changes everything you just heard. There is one more name from that first morning worth pausing on, because it does not fit the pattern of generals and spy chiefs at all, and it might be the single most revealing detail in this entire story. Iran's former president, a man who had not held official power in over a decade, was also reportedly killed that same day in a strike near his own home. He was not sitting in a war room. He was not commanding troops. He was a former head of state who had spent years drifting in and out of favor with Iran's own leadership, occasionally clashing with them publicly, at one point even blocked from running for office again by the country's own vetting authority. Why does that detail matter so much? Because it proves the target list that morning was never limited to the people currently running the war machine. It reached into the country's wider political establishment, into people who represented history and legitimacy rather than active command. That is a very different kind of decision than simply removing the men holding weapons in that exact moment. It tells you whoever built that target list was thinking about power in the widest possible sense, not just the narrowest military one. Nobody with any history inside that system, no matter how far removed from current power, was treated as off-limits. Now here is the part of the story that most coverage completely skipped past, and it is the part that turns this from one dramatic morning into something far bigger. February the 28th was not the first time this happened. It was the second. Go back further, to June of 2025. During an earlier round of fighting, sometimes called the 12-Day War, Israeli strikes on Tehran and Iran's command centers killed the man who was then the head of the Revolutionary Guard, the Armed Forces Chief of Staff at that time, the commander running the wartime headquarters, and the officer in charge of Iran's missile and aerospace force, along with several senior officers underneath them. A university dean and nuclear physicist was killed in that same round of strikes too. Now line those two lists up side by side. June 2025 and February 2026. Look at the job titles, not just the names. Head of the AEI Revolutionary Guard, killed in 2025, replaced, and then that replacement's entire command circle wiped out again in 2026. Armed Forces Chief of Staff, same story, a completely different man holding the job by the time the second wave arrived. The officer overseeing missiles and drones, same pattern again. Even the nuclear thread repeats itself. A physicist killed in the first wave. Senior figures from the country's own nuclear research organization killed in the second. This is not two unrelated attacks that happen to share a little overlap. This is a campaign that has now proven twice that it can reach into one specific chair of power, no matter who is sitting in it. It does not matter who Iran promotes next. It does not matter how carefully the next appointment is kept secret. The seat itself appears to be the target, not just the person filling it on any given day. I want you to actually think about your own attention span for a second, because you have already made it further into this than most people do into any video. That tells me something about you, so do one small thing before we go into the parts almost nobody else has properly explained. Drop a comment right now with just the number 40, nothing else. I want to see exactly how many of you are still paying close attention, because what comes next is where the story turns from strange into genuinely disturbing. Now sit with that timeline for a moment, because it completely changes what that famous number, 40 in a minute, actually means. 8 months before that February strike, Israel had already wiped out the top of the Revolutionary Guard, the Armed Forces Command, and the entire missile leadership. Every single one of those positions had to be rebuilt from scratch in the months between the two wars. New commanders, new chiefs of staff, new heads of missile command, people who had barely settled into their new jobs, stepping into roles that had just been violently emptied out months earlier. Think about what that actually does to any organization, not just a government. Losing your top leadership once is a crisis you can, in theory, recover from. You promote from within. You bring in experienced people. You rebuild slowly and carefully over time. But losing it a second time, only months later, with a fresh and inexperienced group barely settled into their new seats, is something else. Entirely. It is not just losing people anymore. It is losing the accumulated trust, the informal relationships, and the operational knowledge that never shows up on any official chart, but is exactly what makes a large institution actually function day to day. Militaries normally plan succession over years, sometimes decades, slowly grooming officers, so that knowledge transfers smoothly from one generation to the next. Compressing that entire process into a matter of months, twice, under active wartime pressure is about as close to organizational collapse as you can get without a state formally ceasing to exist on paper. It is worth pausing specifically on the nuclear thread because it runs through both waves in a way that feels far too consistent to be coincidence. A leading physicist killed in 2025. Senior figures from the country's most secretive nuclear research body killed in 2026. That kind of expertise does not transfer to a replacement overnight. It represents years, sometimes decades, of specialized training that cannot simply be reassigned the way a job title can. The damage in that one specific area may end up outlasting almost everything else on this list, quietly shaping the country's future long after the headlines about this war have faded from everyone's memory. Here is where the story gets even stranger, because it did not end in February, not even close. In the immediate chaos after Khamenei's death, Iran scrambled to answer an old and deeply uncomfortable question. Who actually leads the country now? Official succession planning pointed toward his son, who would eventually be recognized as the new Supreme Leader. But in the middle of an active war, with command structures shattered overnight, real day-to-day authority did not sit with a formal title. It sat with whoever could actually hold the machinery of the state together while missiles were still falling from the sky. According to multiple independent reports at the time, that person was Ali Larijani. He was not some emergency appointee suddenly thrust into a role by crisis. He had been one of the most recognizable names in Iranian politics for decades. A former Speaker of Parliament, a repeat presidential candidate, a genuine insider trusted at the very highest levels of the regime. After Khamenei's death, multiple outlets covering the war closely described him as the country's real leader in practice. The man actually running the state's response behind the scenes while a formal successor was still being arranged. On March the 17th, 2026, Ali Larijani was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Tehran. Israel's own defense minister confirmed the killing directly and bluntly in public. Iranian state media reported that Larijani was targeted while at his daughter's home east of the city. Reports at the time suggested significant intelligence resources had been specifically dedicated to tracking his movements in the weeks leading up to that strike. This was not a lucky hit on someone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was a deliberate, sustained hunt for the single most influential man left standing inside Iran's entire government. The head of Iran's paramilitary Basij force and his deputy were killed in that same operation that same night, along with members of Larijani's own security detail. Think about what it means for a country to effectively lose the person, actually holding it together twice within 19 days. Larijani was not a minor official who happened to be unlucky. By nearly every account, he was the person genuinely running Iran's response to this war in the days after Khamenei's death. His killing suggests Israeli intelligence had penetrated Iran's emergency post-assassination command structure just as thoroughly as it had penetrated the structure that existed before the war even started. Whatever new layers of secrecy Iran tried to build around its emergency leadership after February, it was not enough to keep the man at the center of it alive for even a single month. By the way, if you are still here, I want to say something honestly. Most people click away long before this point in a video like this. You did not. That tells me you actually care about understanding the world, not just skimming a headline and moving on. So please, share this with one person who only ever heard the 40-minute headline and never learned what came after it. That single share genuinely matters more than you think. And the pattern did not stop with Larijani either. Just 3 days later, on March the 20th, more names emerged. The spokesperson for the Revolutionary Guard, the public face of the regime's wartime messaging for years, a man who had lived through an entire earlier war only to die in this one, was killed in an airstrike. A senior intelligence figure inside the Basij paramilitary organization died the same day, alongside a senior commander from Iran's Ministry of Intelligence. Think about what that specific combination represents. Not soldiers standing on a front line, not field commanders directing troops. The person whose entire job was shaping how tens of millions of Iranians understood this war, gone in the same week as the internal intelligence arm of the country's largest paramilitary organization, and a senior figure inside the civilian intelligence ministry. 3 completely different institutional functions collapsed within days of each other, on top of everything that had already happened earlier that same month. Put the whole timeline together, and it becomes almost hard to process emotionally, let alone strategically. In less than one single week, Iran lost its de facto national leader, the commander of its largest paramilitary force and his deputy, the public voice of its military, the internal intelligence chief of that same paramilitary organization, and a senior figure inside its intelligence ministry. 5 separate pillars of power, gone within 7 days of each other on top of everything already lost weeks before. Analysts who track this kind of institutional damage for a living describe the likely effect in careful, measured language, saying these repeated strikes had probably caused real shock and disruption inside Iran's internal security apparatus. That is a cautious, academic way of describing something that, once you actually lay the names and dates side by side, looks far more dramatic than any careful sentence can fully capture. Step back for a moment and think about how this looked from the outside. In capitals far from Tehran, other governments were watching this unfold in real time, quietly recalculating their own assumptions, almost overnight. If a state built specifically to survive betrayal from within could still lose its entire chain of command twice in under a year, what does that mean? For every other government built on a similar model of layered, redundant control, this stopped being a story only about Iran. It became a live demonstration of exactly how far modern intelligence and air power can now reach into a system that had spent decades assuming it was untouchable. Markets reacted the way markets always do to shocks like this, bluntly and immediately. Oil prices moved. Shipping routes through the region got recalculated overnight. Allies and rivals of Iran alike spent the following days quietly asking the same basic question. Everyone outside was asking too. If the people actually in charge kept changing week to week, who exactly were you even supposed to negotiate with, threaten, or plan around? For a strange stretch of this war, the honest answer seemed to be that nobody knew for certain, not even people inside Iran itself. Think about what that uncertainty does to diplomacy itself. Negotiations depend on knowing who can actually make a decision and make it stick. A ceasefire, a back-channel message, a quiet agreement to de-escalate, all of that requires someone on the other side with real authority to say yes and have it hold. When that person can be removed within weeks of taking the role, every conversation becomes provisional. Every promise carries an expiration date nobody can predict. Foreign officials who had spent years building relationships with specific Iranian counterparts suddenly found themselves working with strangers, and then working with strangers again a few weeks later. That is not just a leadership crisis inside Iran, it is a diplomatic fog that spreads outward to everyone trying to deal with the country from the outside. And underneath every strategic analysis, every careful phrase from foreign ministries and think tanks, there is a simpler, harder truth worth sitting with quietly for a second. Every single name on this list was a real person, with a family, with a household that depended on them. Khamenei's own daughter, son-in-law, and grandchild were reportedly killed alongside him in that first strike. Larijani was killed at his own daughter's home. These were never abstract chess pieces removed from a board somewhere, far away. They were people whose deaths sent shockwaves through households that had nothing to do with the war rooms and command centers this story keeps circling back to. So here's the honest way to add all of this up. This was never one decapitation strike. It was at least 3 distinct waves stretched across roughly 9 months in June of 2025, February of 2026, and March of 2026, each one hitting a different generation of leadership, occupying largely the same roles. Every single time Iran filled a position that had just been emptied out, whether through routine succession or emergency wartime appointment, that replacement became a target too. In Larijani's case specifically, the single most senior replacement in the entire government was tracked down and killed within 19 days of stepping into that role. That is not a dramatic single night. That is a sustained campaign built on one working assumption that killing the current leadership alone would never be enough, because whoever stepped up to replace them would need to be found and removed as well. And that assumption changes what decapitation even means as a military strategy. The traditional idea behind a strike like this is simple. Remove the head, and the body loses direction, at least for a while, long enough to gain whatever advantage you were looking for. But this was never a single removal followed by a pause to see what happened next. It was closer to a standing policy. Rebuild, and we will find the new leadership too. Replace the replacement, and we will find them as well. That is a fundamentally different kind of pressure to operate under, not just for the people occupying these roles today, but for anyone Iran might try to promote into them next. Every single appointment becomes, in effect, an open question about how long that person actually has left. Before we get to how this all ends, one honest note, because a story built from this many separate reports across 9 months genuinely deserves that kind of honesty. The core numbers here, the 40 commanders in under a minute, the earlier strikes from June 2025, Larijani's killing in March, and the deaths that follow just days later, all come from multiple independent sources, including Israeli military statements, Iranian state media confirmations, and international news coverage tracking this war closely as it unfolded. Some smaller details, particularly names translated out of Persian into English by different outlets working under real-time pressure, may carry small inconsistencies from one report to another. That is a normal feature of any fast-moving story this size, not a sign that the core pattern is not real. The core pattern itself, the repeated, deliberate targeting of replacement leadership, is confirmed again and again across separate strikes, months apart, by separate sources. It is also worth remembering how unusual it is for any military to confirm numbers like this so quickly and so plainly. Militaries do not typically announce their own kill counts in language as specific as 40 commanders in under a minute, unless they want that message heard clearly, both by the enemy and by anyone else watching from the outside. That statement was never just a battlefield report. It was a message aimed directly at whoever might be considering stepping into one of those now empty seats. A warning wrapped quietly inside a single number. If this video has genuinely taught you something you did not know 5 minutes ago, this is the moment to act on it. Because it tells this channel that stories built with this much care are worth making again. Subscribe if you have not already, because what happens after this war is honestly just as strange as everything you just heard. And send this to one person who still thinks this entire story started and ended with a single headline. Because here is what you are actually left with, once you step back from every individual name and date, not one number, not 40. What you're left with is a leadership structure that kept regenerating and kept getting cut down again, over and over, for the better part of a year. The Supreme Leader and his inner circle, gone in February. The man actually holding the country together after him, gone by March. The propaganda chief, the internal intelligence networks, senior figures inside the intelligence ministry, all gone within days of that. And somehow, through all of it, the Iranian state kept functioning. Not smoothly, not without deep invisible cracks running through nearly every branch of it, but it kept functioning. And that fact alone might be the strangest part of this entire story. Because whatever resilience Iran's government has managed to show simply by continuing to exist through 9 months of this, it is resilience built on top of a leadership structure that has now had to rebuild itself from almost nothing, more than once, faster than most militaries on Earth can complete a single routine change of command. Whoever holds real power in Tehran today inherited a job that has, in less than a year, already proven fatal to at least 3 separate people who held versions of it before them. That is not a footnote. That is the entire environment anyone in that position now has to operate inside every single day, whether they say it out loud or not. Power in that government no longer. Looks like something you win and quietly keep. It looks like something you're handed, knowing exactly what happened to almost everyone who held it right before you. And maybe that is the real lesson sitting underneath every name, every date, every institution mentioned in this story. Numbers like 40 are easy to remember and easy to repeat. They fit cleanly into a headline, but they also flatten something far more complicated into something that feels finished, like one dramatic event you can file away and move on from. What actually happened here refused to stay finished. It kept happening quietly, in waves, long after most people had already stopped paying attention to the story at all. The version of this war that lives in most people's memory is one bold, shocking opening minute. The real version is 9 months of a government being taken apart piece by piece, generation by generation, faster than it could ever put itself back together. Think about how differently this story would read if it had ended on that first night. A single strike. A single shocking number. A government stunned but still standing, slowly rebuilding in the months that followed. That would have been a story about a wound. What actually happened is a story about something closer to erosion. A process that kept returning long after the world assumed it was over, each time finding whoever had just stepped into the gap left by the last wave. Erosion does not announce itself the way an explosion does. It works quietly in the background, while the headlines move on to other things. And by the time anyone adds up the full pattern, months have already passed and the damage has already settled deep into the structure itself. There is also something worth remembering about what this means for the people still standing inside that system right now, the officers, the ministers, the officials who were never named in any of these strikes but who watched every single one of their colleagues disappear, in the span of a single year. Every decision they make now, every meeting they attend, every public appearance, happens inside the shadow of what happened to the people who sat in their chairs before them. That kind of pressure does not show up in any official statement. It does not get measured in casualty figures, but it shapes how a government actually behaves, quietly, from the inside, in ways that may take years to fully understand. 40 in a minute was never really the whole story. It was only the loudest opening line of a much longer one. If this is the first time you have truly understood what happened inside that war, do not keep it to yourself. Like this video, subscribe for the next one, and send it to someone who still thinks it started and ended in a single headline. Some stories deserve more than 60 seconds of your attention, even when 60 seconds was exactly how long it took to change everything.